Their disappearance was never officially explained, their manifests erased, their personnel unaccounted for. The problem of supply was among the most decisive challenges of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's geography was both its greatest strength and its most crippling obstacle. Roads were few, railways often single-tracked and overstretched, and the mechanized columns that supported offensives like Operation Uranus or Little Saturn required a constant influx of fuel and spare parts. The steppe, a terrain of dust in summer and mud in autumn, swallowed entire convoys in its immensity. Trucks bogged down in salt marshes or were buried by shifting dunes. In winter, temperatures below -30 degrees immobilized engines and froze lubricants solid. The Logistical Command under the People's Commissariat of Defense recorded more than 1.2 million tons of material lost to transport interruptions between July 1942 and March 1943. The southern steppes geography created conditions unlike any other front. The region between Elista, Astrakhan, and Stalingrad stretched hundreds of kilometers without reliable infrastructure. The railheads at Saratov and Balashov were often bombed, forcing convoys to rely on improvised roads. Local civilians, often Kalmyk herders or deported populations, were conscripted to repair bridges or guide trucks through the wilderness. But the steppe could turn against them without warning. Sandstorms buried roads overnight, sudden temperature drops cracked radiators and left engines useless. Entire battalions of supply drivers, drawn from penal units or untrained recruits, faced isolation without radio communication. When the front shifted rapidly in either direction, logistical routes were cut off, and the convoys stranded in no man's land. Luftwaffe records from the 4th Air Fleet mention convoy clusters destroyed east of Kotelnikovo and north of Elista in late 1942, many of them without visible escorts. Pilots reported burning oil columns and scattered wreckage, but no survivors. The German Army's intelligence estimated that the Soviets lost up to 400 supply trucks in the Kalmyk steppe during the retreat from Stalingrad alone. These losses, however, were never fully reflected in Soviet records. Documents declassified in the 1990s from the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense reveal that many missing convoys were categorized under non-combat disappearance or unverified logistical losses, designations that effectively erased their existence from official wartime summaries. The political context of these vanishings also played a role in their silence. During 1942, any failure in supply was interpreted as sabotage, cowardice, or incompetence. The NKVD's special department attached to the Transport Directorate reported at least 8,000 arrests for loss of military property and failure to deliver. In some cases, drivers or officers whose convoys had vanished were tried in absentia, declared guilty before evidence could even be gathered. The climate of fear encouraged falsification of reports, meaning that entire sections of logistical records were fabricated to show successful deliveries that never occurred. For the men who actually drove the convoys, survival was as uncertain as navigation itself. Fuel shortages forced many to siphon reserves from abandoned vehicles or melt snow for radiator water. The distances were immense. From Saratov to Elista was more than 700 kilometers of near featureless plain. Compass bearings were unreliable, and radio equipment was scarce. When night fell and the wind rose, even experienced drivers could lose direction entirely. Dozens of testimonies collected decades later describe convoys splitting apart, columns wandering in circles, or units deciding to abandon trucks and proceed on foot toward settlements that no longer existed. Beyond environmental and logistical causes, there were also darker possibilities. Intelligence intercepts from the German 17th Army mentioned irregular partisan activity and armed raiding groups operating east of the Don. Soviet documents confirm that some deserters, local bandits, and even retreating Red Army stragglers turned to looting convoys for food and fuel. The frontier between loyal and criminal blurred across the steppe's emptiness. NKVD field detachments reported several incidents in which entire supply columns were found days later. These were often attributed to enemy saboteurs, though in many cases there was no evidence of German presence. By early 1943, the Red Army's logistical strategy shifted, relying more heavily on railway corridors and frontline depots. But by then, hundreds of vehicles and thousands of personnel had vanished without trace. The Soviet archives, once examined in the post-war years, revealed peculiar absences: supply manifests without receipt records, driver lists with names later found among those executed for desertion, or material tallies that exceeded production figures. What began as a logistical anomaly evolved into a quiet historical enigma. Somewhere in the vastness between the Don and the Caspian, the convoys of the steppe were swallowed by war and time alike, erased from memory, yet essential to understanding how the Soviet war machine sustained itself through catastrophe. As the Soviet front stabilized along the lower Volga and in the Caucasus during late 1942, the logistical routes through the steppe became arteries of survival. Every rifle, every ration, every drop of fuel moving toward Stalingrad or Grozny passed through these exposed supply lines. The responsibility for maintaining them fell to the Red Army's motor transport troops and the People's Commissariat for Railways, both operating under extraordinary pressure. The Southern Theater's demand for supplies exceeded capacity by almost 60%, and the few available routes, mostly dirt tracks and incomplete rail spurs, were pushed beyond endurance. Every day, thousands of trucks set out from depots along the Volga with critical cargo. Some reached their destinations days late, others disappeared completely. The opening phase of this Army Group B, commanded by General Maximilian von Weichs, aimed to cut Soviet supply arteries by advancing along the Don and toward Astrakhan. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units patrolled deep into the steppe, identifying convoys for interdiction. Soviet reports from the Southern Front described sudden and complete losses of vehicle columns in July and August, often without a single survivor or a trace of wreckage. In some cases, communications failed for days. When search teams finally arrived, they found burned-out trucks still loaded with supplies, suggesting ambush or bombing. The fate of their crews was seldom recorded. At the same time, the Soviet High Command issued urgent orders to reinforce the supply lines that linked the Caucasus to the Volga Basin. These routes crossed sparsely populated terrain where settlements were few and infrastructure non-existent. Convoys had to carry not only fuel and food for the army, but also their own reserves, creating a paradox where transport consumed nearly as much as it delivered. The typical ZIS-5 truck, loaded with 3 tons of cargo, could barely travel 150 kilometers before needing refueling, yet distances between depots often exceeded 300 kilometers. Tanker trucks lagged behind or broke down, forcing drivers to siphon fuel from abandoned vehicles. The combination of overextension, inadequate navigation tools, and constant harassment by German air patrols created a logistical environment close to collapse. The Red Army's operational focus on offense left little room for the meticulous planning supply operations required. Headquarters at the Stalingrad and North Caucasus fronts often issued contradictory directives, one ordering trucks to avoid roads during daylight, another requiring continuous movement regardless of hour. These inconsistencies exposed the convoys to maximum risk. Air attacks destroyed hundreds of vehicles weekly, but equally destructive were the steppe's own elements. Dust storms reduced visibility to zero, engines overheated, tires shredded on rough ground, and the slightest mechanical failure could strand a vehicle for days. By August 1942, reports from the 62nd and 64th Armies warned of irregular supply flow and vanished transports between Kamyshin and Elista. Many of these convoys were composed of newly mobilized drivers with minimal training, including women, penal unit personnel, and captured German trucks pressed into Soviet service. When caught between advancing Wehrmacht units and encroaching partisans or desert conditions, entire columns were lost. One documented case, Convoy K347, left Kamyshin on August 10th with 47 vehicles carrying rations and ammunition for the 64th Army. It never arrived. Weeks later, NKVD field detachments were tasked with investigating these disappearances. Their reports, preserved in the Central Archive of the Federal Security Service, reveal how quickly logistical loss became political accusation. Missing convoys were interpreted as desertion, sabotage, or theft. Surviving drivers who reappeared after days of wandering were interrogated and sometimes executed for abandoning cargo. Commanders falsified reports to avoid punishment, marking convoys as delayed due to weather or rerouted by order of the front. This systemic concealment made it nearly impossible to reconstruct accurate loss statistics. Meanwhile, German intelligence noted the growing disorganization of Soviet supply. Luftwaffe radio intercepts indicated confusion among Soviet convoy commands, with repeated calls for coordinates and fuel assistance. In early September 1942, the German 4th Panzer Army reported intercepting 2 unguarded motorized supply columns near Elista, which were destroyed with ease. Their destruction deepened Soviet shortages at a critical phase of the Stalingrad defense, forcing the Red Army to rely on river barges under constant bombardment. For the soldiers at the front, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Rations were cut, ammunition deliveries delayed, and fuel allocation slashed by up to half. The invisible war for supply became as decisive as any tank engagement. Yet amid this chaos, no single event explained the disappearance of so many convoys. The vastness of the steppe, combined with shifting front lines and minimal record-keeping, created an environment where units could vanish between 2 map points. And history, but what the returning forces found in the steppe defied simple classification: convoys half buried in sand, trucks stripped of metal, and human remains lying beside unopened crates of supplies. The mystery of how so many men and vehicles could vanish without a trace had only begun to surface. The steppe had become a graveyard of logistics, a place where war consumed its own lifeline, silently and completely. The Soviet logistical crisis deepened through the winter of 1942-1943, when freezing winds turned the open steppe into an impassable wasteland. Convoys that had survived the summer's heat now faced the inverse: snowdrifts meters high, temperatures plunging below 35 degrees C, and mechanical systems incapable of enduring the cold. The engines of ZS and gas trucks froze solid, batteries died, and oil thickened into paste. Each kilometer of progress demanded constant effort, heating fuel in as the Red Army launched its counteroffensive at Stalingrad. The logistical apparatus supporting it was itself collapsing under the weight of weather and exhaustion. By December 1942, Soviet High Command recognized that its southern supply structure was nearing total failure. Field reports from the 57th and 51st Armies revealed that entire columns sent from Astrakhan and Saratov failed to reach forward depots. A series of radio messages between the Transportation Directorate and the Stalingrad Front headquarters documented 17 convoys presumed lost between December 3rd and 19th. Search parties dispatched along known routes found only abandoned trucks, some still upright, their cargoes intact, but their crews gone. Tire tracks vanished into frozen plains, leading to speculation that some groups had attempted to march eastward on foot and succumbed to exposure. The disappearance of these convoys was not only a logistical failure, but a political problem. In Moscow, the State Defense Committee demanded explanations. NKVD commissars accused local military authorities of negligence and criminal concealment of property losses. Between December 1942 and February 1943, at least 210 officers and drivers were arrested in the southern sectors for cowardice, sabotage, or unauthorized withdrawal. Yet the scale of loss made intentional wrongdoing implausible. The convoys vanished too completely, often over vast distances, for human misconduct alone to explain them. Environmental data from the period reveal the extraordinary severity of conditions. The winter storm system that struck the lower Volga on December 10th lasted 9 days, with winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 30 meters. In such conditions, direction and distance became meaningless. Drivers relied on compasses and road markers that the blizzard buried or displaced. Once fuel ran out, they burned parts of their own vehicles to stay warm. Soviet meteorological stations recorded temperatures of 42 degrees near Elista on December 14th, enough to kill an unprotected human in less than 20 minutes. When spring arrived and snow receded, reconnaissance flights from the 8th Air Army began to spot black shapes scattered across the landscape. Ground teams later identified some of these as remnants of lost convoys, burned, overturned, or stripped. In one area southeast of Kotelnikovo, over 60 trucks lay clustered in a shallow depression, many still carrying unopened crates of ammunition. No human remains were found. The NKVD labeled the site Convoy K204 and classified its investigation. Similar reports emerged from The absence of visible combat damage led to conflicting theories: mechanical failure, navigational error, or spontaneous abandonment under psychological strain. German intelligence also took note of these vanishings. A captured Wehrmacht operations diary from Army Group Dawn mentioned Soviet supply movements lost to terrain and speculated that climatic attrition exceeds enemy combat losses. German units occasionally encountered derelict Soviet vehicles along routes they themselves later used. They salvaged tires, fuel, and sometimes even rations, but the mystery of the vanished personnel remained. Prisoner interrogations produced contradictory statements. Some claimed their comrades were captured or defected. Others described entire columns immobilized and left behind under orders to prioritize combat units. The loss of these convoys had measurable strategic consequences. The Red Army's offensive tempo slowed dramatically. Fuel shortages grounded air operations and immobilized tank formations. Ammunition deliveries to the front dropped by almost 40% in January 1943. Despite the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the Soviet advance risked halting not because of resistance, but because supply lines could no longer sustain it. To compensate, the command shifted resources from other sectors, rerouting trains from the Urals and diverting food shipments from the Caucasus. Each adaptation placed new strain on already exhausted infrastructure. As Soviet control expanded westward, the question of the lost convoys faded from immediate concern. Victory overshadowed the logistics that made it possible. Many of the missing transports were never reported as destroyed, only unconfirmed. Archival records from the Central Transport Directorate show gaps where convoy numbers should appear, suggesting deliberate omission. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army's logistical network began a slow recovery, yet the mysteries of the lost convoys persisted across the southern steppe. With the thaw came access to regions previously buried under snow and ice, and investigation teams were dispatched to locate missing transport units and recover usable materiel. What they found deepened the confusion, rather than clarifying it. Many convoys were discovered precisely along their assigned routes, their trucks still laden with supplies, yet the crews were absent, no signs of struggle, footprints, or gunfire damage. Some vehicles were neatly parked, engines off, as though abandoned in haste, but without violence. In others, food and documents were untouched, indicating that the drivers had not been ambushed, but had simply vanished. These recovery missions were conducted under the supervision of the NKVD's Directorate for Transport. Commanders were instructed to rectify irregularities in loss reporting and ensure no recurrence of unexplained disappearances. But the silence around the earlier events remained deliberate. The missing convoys had become politically toxic, an embarrassment inconsistent with the narrative of a perfectly functioning war machine. Behind this silence lay the reality that the Soviet logistical network in 1942-43 had been overstretched beyond comprehension. Supplies from the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia converged toward the front through a maze of rivers, rail lines, and unpaved roads. In the southern regions, where rail infrastructure was destroyed or incomplete, the burden fell entirely on motorized transport. Trucks operated in convoys of 30 to 60 vehicles, often guarded by hastily assembled rifle platoons or penal detachments. Communication equipment was scarce. Once a convoy left a depot, it frequently moved for days without. When blizzards or sandstorms struck, they were entirely isolated. A single navigational error could send them into terrain that no map depicted accurately: salt flats, sinkholes, and dry riverbeds that could swallow trucks whole. The technical inadequacy of Soviet vehicles compounded these vulnerabilities. The ZIS-5, the workhorse of the Red Army's Transport Corps, had a limited range and poor performance on soft ground. Spare parts were unavailable, and many engines were assembled with low-grade alloys that failed under extreme heat or cold. Tires were in chronic shortage. Many convoys drove on retreads that disintegrated after a few hundred kilometers. When breakdowns occurred, the solution was often abandonment. A report from the 4th Front Motorized Directorate dated October 1943 described over 11,000 trucks lost to mechanical In addition to natural and technical causes, the human factor grew increasingly unstable. By 1943, the Soviet Union's manpower crisis reached deep into the logistical core. Thousands of experienced drivers were reassigned to combat roles, replaced by hastily trained recruits, teenagers, women, and older civilians. Their discipline and navigation skills were limited. NKVD detachments attached to convoy units filed dozens of complaints about disorderly conduct and failure to maintain formation. Under conditions of fatigue, hunger, and fear, morale collapsed quickly. Testimonies from surviving drivers collected in the 1960s described the unbearable psychological strain. Days without rest, engines roaring in darkness, the vast emptiness of the steppe stretching in every direction. The phenomenon of deserted convoys, which appeared again in early 1944 reports, may have been the cumulative. Oral testimonies collected decades later describe locals scavenging from abandoned trucks, metal for tools, fabric for clothing, even gasoline for heating. Some communities buried human remains they found, others reported them to Soviet authorities, who often responded by sealing the area or removing evidence entirely. When the NKVD began the forced deportation of the Kalmyk population in December 1943, one justification cited was unreliability and assistance to enemy intelligence. Historians now believe that accusations of looting Soviet convoys may have contributed to these collective punishments. While the Soviet states suppressed open discussion of the lost convoys, the German side continued to analyze the phenomenon through intercepted communications. Reports compiled by Army Group South Intelligence in late 1943 referred to widespread. These zones, sometimes stretching for kilometers, contained wreckage arranged in patterns suggesting confusion rather than combat. Analysts concluded that the Red Army's logistical system had overextended beyond what terrain and weather could sustain. Ironically, by early 1944, the same problem afflicted German supply lines retreating westward, as the steppe devoured their columns just as it had the Soviet ones 2 years before. In the post-war reconstruction period, Soviet engineers revisiting the area for road projects frequently encountered remnants of these wartime losses. Survey teams in 1947 cataloged hundreds of rusting trucks and fuel drums scattered across Kalmykia and the Lower Don. Yet even then, official acknowledgement was absent. The reports used bureaucratic euphemisms such as obsolete wartime material and non-recoverable equipment. The fate of the missing drivers was never The mystery of the lost convoys, already fading from institutional memory, remained locked in archives for half a century. But its implications persisted in the Soviet logistical doctrine that followed. Later generations of military planners studied these disappearances not as tragedies, but as lessons about overextension, weather forecasting, fuel discipline, and human endurance. Yet the essential truth remained unchanged. The convoys had vanished not in the chaos of battle, but in the intersection between human ambition and the boundless, indifferent expanse of the steppe, where the line between logistical failure and human erasure blurred beyond recognition. By early 1944, the logistical focus of the Red Army had shifted north and west, but the southern steppe remained scattered with the wreckage of its earlier campaigns. The war moved on, yet its ghost convoys remained, half buried in dust, silent witnesses to a system that had demanded total efficiency, but often delivered catastrophe. As the Soviet advance pressed beyond the Dnieper, military engineers and recovery units were dispatched to clear the remaining equipment and reclaim usable metal. What they found reinforced a grim realization. The steppe had devoured not only machines but also men, and no amount of bureaucratic revision could fully erase their disappearance. Recovered convoys from early 1944 were often found in eerily similar condition. Trucks aligned in neat formation, hatches sealed, some cargo untouched. In several cases, engines had been disabled deliberately, perhaps in compliance with orders to prevent capture, but there were no signs of combat. A report from the 2nd Southern Recovery Brigade dated February 1944 recorded approximately 70 vehicles located intact south of Yashkul containing fuel, rations, and ammunition. The drivers and guards, nearly 200 men, were missing. Footprints radiated outward into the open terrain before fading. Nearby, several shallow pits indicated attempts to dig shelters, but none contained remains. The report concluded with bureaucratic restraint. Personnel presumed perished. Cause: unknown meteorological conditions. The same pattern emerged across other sectors. NKVD and Army logistics personnel sent to document the sites were often ordered to destroy any sensitive materials found with the vehicles, including correspondence, route maps, or driver logs. A few surviving copies suggest why. Many convoy reports contained open complaints about impossible orders, fuel rationing, and contradictory directives from higher command. Others hinted at encounters with local bandit formations or unidentified armed groups. In an atmosphere of paranoia, even acknowledging these dangers was politically risky. Commanders chose silence over explanation, and entire sections of archival records were redacted or rewritten before submission to Moscow. Still, enough fragments survived to reconstruct the broader reality. Soviet logistics in the southern steppe had collapsed under a convergence of environmental, administrative, and human pressures. The Red Army's transport system depended on coordination across thousands of kilometers, yet decisions were made from hundreds of kilometers away, often without regard to terrain or conditions. Supplies were allocated by mathematical formula, not practical capacity. A division requiring 500 tons of fuel per week might receive that order on paper, but only a fraction ever arrived. Convoys overloaded beyond mechanical limits were pushed into terrain with no infrastructure or recovery plan. Once stranded, they became isolated, invisible, and ultimately expendable. The steppe itself compounded these systemic failures with indifference. The geography of the region, flat, horizonless, without landmarks, made orientation nearly impossible. When windstorms struck, drivers lost visual reference and could no longer distinguish direction. Some turned in circles until fuel ran out. Others followed compass bearings that drifted off course by only a few degrees, but over hundreds of kilometers led into emptiness. A single misjudged turn could send a convoy deep into uninhabited zones, where neither rescue nor return was possible. Even aircraft sent to locate them reported that visibility from above was poor. The trucks blended with the earth. The land was both battlefield and graveyard. For Soviet authorities, the discovery of these ghost convoys created an uncomfortable contradiction. The state that prided itself on control and documentation now faced evidence of mass disappearance within its own ranks. Instead of public inquiry, The response was quiet erasure. A directive from the General Staff, dated April 5, 1944, instructed all frontline transportation units to consolidate and simplify historical records of logistic operations and to omit details of disrupted or incomplete missions. In effect, this meant rewriting the logistical history of the Southern Front. Missing convoys became redeployed assets, and their personnel were posthumously transferred to other units on paper. Local civilians sometimes uncovered these lost units years later, long after the front had passed. In 1946, a team of railway surveyors working near the dried Manic River Basin found a cluster of 24 Soviet trucks buried under layers of windblown sand. Inside, skeletal remains sat still in the driver's seats, some wearing faded uniforms, others covered by rags. Tools, ammunition, and ration tins were undisturbed, suggesting that death had come swiftly, perhaps through carbon monoxide poisoning during an attempt to stay warm. The discovery was reported to the local NKVD office but never publicized. The site was cleared and classified as hazardous material zone. Not all discoveries were so final. In isolated Kalmyk settlements, stories circulated about survivors, drivers who had wandered for days before reaching villages, delirious and frostbitten, recounting visions of light columns and silent plains filled with frozen trucks. Most were taken away by Soviet security forces for debriefing and were never heard from again. Oral testimonies collected decades later by regional historians suggest that at least a few survived, but were sent to labor camps, accused of abandoning. Their accounts, though unverifiable, share uncanny consistency. The sensation of the steppe, closing in, compasses spinning erratically, and the haunting quiet of stalled engines under a blackened sky. By mid-1944, the logistical system of the Red Army had evolved beyond the chaotic improvisations that had defined its earlier years. Railroads advanced with the front, depots were standardized, and radio communication improved. But the memory of the steppe convoys remained buried under administrative denial. In official Soviet wartime histories published after 1945, the transport efforts of 1942-43 were portrayed as heroic endurance under extreme conditions, with no mention of the convoys that vanished. Yet for those who had driven across that vast emptiness, the silence surrounding the truth was its own kind of grave. The war had moved west, but the ghosts of the steppe still waited beneath the wind, where the line. By late 1944, the Soviet war machine had reached an unprecedented level of industrial and logistical coordination. Trains from the Urals, convoys from Central Asia, and river barges along the Volga moved in calculated rhythm toward the front. The memory of the vanished convoys of the southern steppe seemed distant, an aberration of an earlier, more desperate time. Yet inside the Transport Directorate, unease lingered. Senior officers who had served in 1942-43 knew that vast amounts of material and thousands of soldiers had simply disappeared without explanation. The documents had been sealed, the reports rewritten, but the gap in the archives remained too large to ignore. In late 1944, a closed investigation began under the Maine Military Prosecutor's Office, ordered by the State Defense Committee to reconcile inconsistencies in logistical loss reporting. The review covered operations in the southern sectors, from Astrakhan to Rostov, focusing on the missing convoys. Surviving route maps, convoy logs, and NKVD reports were collected from multiple fronts. The result was classified as top secret and never published, but fragments survived in post-war archives. They revealed an uncomfortable truth. The phenomenon was not limited to 1942-43. Even during the Soviet counteroffensives, smaller but consistent disappearances continued. Entire truck platoons vanished between established checkpoints. Radio logs recorded distress signals cut off mid-transmission. Some convoys reported as having departed never appeared on any subsequent record. Investigators quickly encountered contradictions between official documents and field data. Fuel allocations, cargo manifests, and personnel rosters did not align. Convoys listed as destroyed by air attack could not be corroborated by Luftwaffe records. Others were shown to have completed their routes on paper, while their cargo was later found. The pattern suggested not a single cause, but an accumulation of overlapping failures, logistical exhaustion, misreporting, and systemic fear. The Soviet wartime bureaucracy, terrified of punishment, had preferred falsification over admission of loss. Once a convoy was unaccounted for, officers often submitted fabricated reports of success to avoid reprisal. The disappearance of men and materiel was thus hidden beneath layers of invented paperwork. Yet some cases defied bureaucratic explanation. One series of reports from the steppe corridor between Elista and the Caspian dated from November 1943, when the front had already advanced hundreds of kilometers westward. A reconnaissance patrol discovered the remains of 5 trucks, engines intact, cargo undisturbed, their drivers missing. What startled investigators was the condition of the vehicles: radiators filled, tires inflated, and no evidence of looting or external damage. The engines appeared to have been shut off simultaneously. Even Soviet psychologists admitted privately that the behavior described in field reports seemed beyond ordinary exhaustion. Local testimony, however, added another dimension. Civilians from Kalmyk and Nogai settlements recalled encountering ghost convoys during the late stages of the war, columns of vehicles visible at dusk, lights flickering in the distance that vanished when approached. Others spoke of finding abandoned trucks weeks later, footprints leading away and fading into the plains. Though folklore later embellished these accounts, the consistency of their details suggests a shared cultural memory of the disappearances. For many villagers, the steppe became a place of dread, associated not only with death, but with vanishing itself. The NKVD dismissed such testimonies as superstition, but investigators quietly noted that civilian reports often led to the recovery of actual wreck sites, proving that local accounts can. The closed inquiry of 1944-45 concluded with a document known as Report Number 32 on the irrecoverable losses of logistical assets in the southern theaters. Its language was careful but revealing. Of the 327 convoys examined, 418 were listed as lost without enemy engagement. The report attributed these disappearances to a combination of environmental hazards, command disorganization, and inadequate technical support. However, appended to the final page was a cryptic handwritten note from a senior officer. Some cases remain unexplainable. The steppe conceals more than we understand. The report was filed, sealed, and never reopened. After the war, the Soviet Union's official histories erased the incident entirely. Textbooks and propaganda films portrayed war. New training manuals emphasized navigation discipline, radio protocol, and route redundancy, implicitly acknowledging the failures of the past. Yet the culture of silence persisted. To admit that hundreds of convoys had vanished without trace was to acknowledge that even the Red Army, the most organized military apparatus of its time, could lose men not to battle, but to the void. By the end of 1945, the war was over, and reconstruction began. But the archives of the Transport Directorate retained their gaps, and across the steppe, fragments of the vanished convoys remained, rusted wheels, twisted axles, and faded insignia buried in wind-blown soil. Decades later, archaeologists and military historians would rediscover them, their remains untouched since the war. To the modern eye, they seemed ordinary debris. Yet each fragment represented a chapter of disappearance that no record fully captured, a moment when machinery, men, and memory alike were consumed by the vast, indifferent plains of southern Russia. In the post-war years, the mystery of the vanished steppe convoys retreated into the shadows of Soviet historiography, overshadowed by narratives of triumph and reconstruction. Officially, there was no mystery, only logistical disruptions erased by progress. Yet across the southern frontiers, recovery expeditions, geological surveys, and infrastructure projects kept uncovering quiet evidence that the past refused to stay buried. Each discovery reignited questions that no one dared to ask publicly. What had really happened to those convoys that disappeared without combat, without witnesses, without trace? By 1946, the Soviet state faced the Ministry of Transport ordered large-scale recovery operations to reclaim metal, fuel, and machinery from abandoned war zones. In Kalmykia, Stavropol, and Astrakhan Oblast, hundreds of tons of scrap were collected from derelict vehicles scattered across the plains. Yet not all wrecks were ancient. Inspectors frequently reported finding relatively recent remains, trucks whose condition suggested they had been abandoned months, not years, before. In some, drivers' bones were still seated behind the wheel. Others contained identification documents never entered into official casualty registries. A classified memo from the Ministry of Defense dated August 1946 admitted that a significant portion of lost materiel was unaccounted for in wartime documentation, but the number of recovered vehicles was redacted from every copy. These recoveries coincided with a renewed NKVD effort to control the narrative. Officers visiting the sites were instructed to confiscate photographs, forbid civilian observation, and classify all findings under strategic resource salvage. Any suggestion of unexplained disappearance was to be deleted from official correspondence. A 1947 directive explicitly banned mention of ghost convoys in local press or museum archives, emphasizing that logistical difficulties of past operations are not suitable for public discourse. This institutional silence was part of a broader campaign to reshape wartime memory, transforming the chaos of survival into a myth of discipline and unity. The vanished convoys did not fit that image. At the same time, the southern steppes' remoteness continued to produce encounters that blurred the line between archaeology and rumor. Surveyors laying pipelines or building railways sometimes stumbled upon isolated graves marked by makeshift crosses or Soviet helmets. Others found rusted convoys partially entombed by sand, some aligned in precise formations as if halted mid-march. A team of engineers from Astrakhan working in 1948 described a site containing over 30 vehicles half buried in low soil. Inside were skeletons arranged in sitting positions, their hands gripping steering wheels or rifles. No signs of struggle, bullet holes, or explosion were visible. The report was submitted to regional authorities and immediately classified as non-incident industrial discovery. As these findings accumulated, speculation spread quietly among veterans and geographers. Some believed the convoys had fallen victim to toxic gas from oil seeps or salt marsh emissions, suffocating entire columns in their sleep. Others suggested magnetic anomalies or navigational instrument failure caused by geomagnetic. For them, the losses were neither mystical nor purely environmental. They reflected the system's refusal to admit failure. Each vanished convoy was a symptom of institutional blindness, a casualty of an army that demanded perfection from imperfect men. Western intelligence became aware of these stories through defectors and travelers during the early Cold War. British and American analysts, compiling reports on Soviet infrastructure in the South, noted repeated references to missing wartime transport assets. Declassified CIA summaries from 1952 mentioned persistent local legends of vanished Soviet convoys near Elista and the lower Volga, though these were dismissed as rumor. Still, they intrigued analysts studying the logistical limits of Soviet power in remote regions. The legend of the lost convoys, part fact, part cautionary tale, thus entered foreign intelligence archives even as it remained for. Meanwhile, among local populations, the vanished convoys became myth. Kalmyk shepherds spoke of the iron bones of the war lying beneath the sands, their engines still echoing on windy nights. Children growing up in nearby villages were told to avoid certain areas of the steppe where the trucks still wait for orders. These stories, half folklore and half trauma, preserved details that official documents erased: the location of abandoned equipment, the sounds of engines at dusk, the sudden appearance of uniformed men who asked for directions and were never seen again. When ethnographers recorded these oral traditions decades later, they found remarkable consistency. The convoys were always moving east, always in silence, always swallowed by weather that no one else witnessed. By the 1950s, the Soviet military quietly reopened parts of the old routes for new infrastructure projects. Many of these areas overlapped with known disappearance zones, leading to the rediscovery of more sites. Recovery crews were instructed to dismantle wrecks without documentation, and any human remains were reburied in mass graves labeled unknown soldiers. The official position remained that these were casualties of ordinary combat, despite the absence of evidence supporting it. For those on the ground, however, the impression was unmistakable. The landscape itself seemed haunted by the failures of 1942-43. In 1957, a geological survey team working north of the Caspian discovered the remnants of a massive convoy, over 100 vehicles, half buried in sediment. The trucks were arranged in a perfect column, as if halted deliberately. None showed combat damage. Inside the lead vehicle, a logbook dated December 1942 contained the final entry: route established. This discovery, like others before it, was sealed under state secrecy, the vehicles stripped and melted down, the documents archived and never seen again. What began as a wartime logistical catastrophe had by now become something deeper, a historical absence actively maintained by the system that caused it. The steppe had become not only a grave, but a mirror reflecting the limits of state control. Beneath the official narrative of triumph lay thousands of unacknowledged dead, their disappearance explained away by the same bureaucracy that had once sent them into the void. And in that silence, the legend of the lost convoys of the steppe endured, not as superstition, but as the unspoken memory of a war that could erase its own witnesses as completely as its enemies. By the beginning of the 1960s, the Soviet Union had redefined its narrative of the Great Patriotic War. The chaos of early defeats, the logistical collapse of 1941-43, and the uncounted losses of the steppe had been buried beneath layers of patriotic triumph. School textbooks described flawless coordination between front and rear. Films portrayed supply convoys as symbols of endurance and unity. The truth, that hundreds of logistical columns had vanished without combat, leaving only skeletons and rusting steel, had no place in this mythology. Yet even as the archives closed, the physical traces of those losses continued to surface in unexpected ways, forcing the state to confront what it preferred to forget. In 1962, during the expansion of the Volga-Don irrigation system, workers unearthed what appeared to be a wartime camp buried under a dune near Yashkul. It consisted of more than 20 trucks in almost perfect alignment, their canvas covers torn but largely intact. Inside, archaeologists and military historians found uniforms, weapons, and supply crates marked with the 1942 production codes of Gorky Automobile Plant. All engines had been switched off manually. Fuel tanks were full. No bullet holes, no shrapnel, no traces of combat. A shallow trench behind the column contained over 50 human remains, still wearing Red Army boots. The find was reported to Moscow, but within weeks the site was sealed, the bodies reinterred, and official commentary limited to the statement, "Remains of soldiers lost during local defensive operations." Privately, the investigators noted something disturbing. The convoy's logbook was still legible. The final entry, written in a calm hand, read, "No visibility. Compass malfunction. Awaiting further instruction." The date matched early January 1943, precisely the period when dozens of convoys were last recorded passing through the steppe corridor. Despite this, No mention of the discovery ever appeared in scientific journals or war memorial reports. The documents were classified under the internal code Meteorological Anomaly of 1943, a phrase that would later appear in other unrelated excavation records, a bureaucratic shorthand for events the state had no wish to explain. Such anomalies became increasingly common as modernization projects spread across the southern frontier. Construction crews building gas pipelines, military bases, and collective farms encountered relics of the vanished convoys again and again. Each time, the Ministry of Defense dispatched inspection teams to clear the sites, confiscating artifacts and sealing reports. In some cases, entire work zones were evacuated under the pretext of hazardous material contamination. Workers who spoke publicly were reprimanded or relocated. In official correspondence, the convoys were described as residual assets of no strategic importance, but among those who saw them firsthand, there was an unshakable sense that something far larger had been buried, not merely trucks and bones, but the truth of a state that had once consumed its own machinery of survival. By the mid-1960s, a small circle of Soviet military historians began quietly investigating the matter. Among them was Colonel Viktor Mikhailovich Orlov, a logistics officer turned researcher at the Military Academy of Transport. He had served on the Southern Front and remembered hearing whispers about the missing convoys of the Kalmyk steppe. Using his security clearance, Orlov accessed restricted archives and cross-referenced convoy registries from 1942-44. What he discovered contradicted every official account. Nearly 600 convoys listed as delivered to forward depots never arrived anywhere. The names of their drivers appeared in no casualty lists. Their units had been dissolved on paper months later, often with signatures forged or altered. In a 1967 internal memorandum, Orlov wrote, "These losses cannot be explained by enemy action or weather alone. The administrative record has been deliberately cleansed." Orlov's report was suppressed. He was reassigned to an academic post and later retired quietly. But his research survived in the archives of the Academy, where later generations of historians would rediscover it after 1991. His notes revealed that in many cases the disappearance zones corresponded precisely with areas of temporary magnetic disturbances recorded by Soviet geophysical institutes during 1942-43. Whether this was coincidence or a desperate attempt to rationalize the unexplained, Orlov never concluded. He ended his final entry with a single phrase: "The steppe absorbed everything, men, steel, and truth alike." Despite the silence at the top, memory persisted below. Veterans who had served as drivers or mechanics told their stories to families and local museums, often contradicting the heroic narrative. Some recalled being ordered to abandon entire convoys due to engine failure in freezing temperatures, only to discover that no rescue ever came. Others claimed they were forbidden to report lost comrades or vehicles under threat of imprisonment. "You did not lose men," one driver later said in an interview. "You lost statistics. The difference was survival." These testimonies, collected after the collapse of the USSR, revealed how deeply fear had shaped wartime logistics, a system where obedience outweighed survival and silence replaced inquiry. The cultural resonance of the lost convoys deepened with time. In literature and art, they became metaphors for the forgotten cost of total war. Poets of the Khrushchev thaw referenced the iron road that ends in dust. Painters depicted endless plains dotted with rusting silhouettes. The Soviet state, meanwhile, tolerated such imagery only as allegory, never as history. Even into the 1980s, academic publications about wartime logistics omitted the entire southern transport corridor from analysis, as if the region itself had ceased to exist during those crucial months of 1942-43. But silence, however disciplined, cannot erase geography. The winds of the steppe continued to uncover fragments, tire tracks fossilized in clay, shards of glass, insignia plates, human bones scattered by erosion. Each discovery was a reminder that beneath the surface of the Soviet victory lay an older, more ambiguous story. one where the line between heroism and disappearance blurred. The war that had built the foundation of the Soviet myth had also buried thousands in anonymity, victims not of the enemy, but of a machine that demanded obedience until even when the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, the Iron Curtain of secrecy surrounding its wartime archives began to fracture. Historians, journalists, and descendants of the missing seized the opportunity to uncover what decades of censorship had hidden. For the first time, the sealed files of the Wartime Transport Directorate, NKVD field offices, and the military prosecutor's records became accessible, partially, selectively, but enough to reveal the outlines of a truth that had long been buried beneath propaganda and silence. The phenomenon of the lost convoys of the steppe, once dismissed as rumor, emerged as a documented historical fact, though one still shrouded in uncertainty. Researchers examining the newly opened archives discovered vast gaps in wartime accounting. Between 1942 and early 1944, nearly 2,000 supply convoys listed in military dispatches lacked corresponding arrival records. Most of these operated in the southern sectors, from the Volga Basin through Kalmykia and Astrakhan to the Caspian approaches. The documents revealed no consistent cause. Some were logged as destroyed by enemy aircraft without Luftwaffe confirmation. Others were simply lost in transit. What linked them all was the administrative erasure that followed. Commanders filed falsified reports claiming successful delivery, and clerks retroactively reassigned vehicles to other units to maintain statistical coherence. Each paper correction eliminated a disaster. The system had rewritten its own reality, turning absence into efficiency. As declassified maps and communications came to light, historians pieced together a grim logistical pattern. The Southern Front supply routes were disastrously overextended in 1942, stretching hundreds of kilometers across uninhabited plains with minimal radio coverage. Severe winter storms, magnetic disturbances, and mechanical breakdowns rendered navigation unreliable. Entire convoys, already weakened by lack of rest and fuel, were effectively stranded in whiteout conditions. In such isolation, even small errors proved fatal. Crews often abandoned their vehicles to search for help, only to perish in the freezing void. Yet even this tragic explanation did not account for the total absence of remains in many cases. Several routes where hundreds of vehicles vanished showed no wreckage at all, only occasional tire impressions, abruptly ending mid-track. Some investigators proposed that scavenging or post-war reclamation had erased the evidence. The Soviet Union's desperate post-war metal recovery programs indeed stripped the landscape of thousands of wrecks. But others, including modern geographers, argued that the topography of the lower Volga steppe itself had played a role. The combination of sand dunes, seasonal flooding, and shifting soil could, over decades, bury entire convoys beneath the earth. Satellite imagery later confirmed that subsidence zones existed precisely where multiple disappearance clusters had been recorded. These findings suggested that nature, not conspiracy, may have claimed what bureaucracy and ideology could not explain. Still, not all evidence pointed toward natural causes. In 1994, an expedition by the Russian Military Historical Society rediscovered the remnants of a large convoy near the dried basin of Lake Baskinchak. The site contained over 60 vehicles buried under meters of compacted clay. Many engines were intact, their controls set to idle. Inside several cabins, human skeletons sat in normal driving positions, unarmed and uninjured. The arrangement implied no panic, no violence, only cessation. Samples of soil and metal were taken, revealing no toxins or radiation. The convoy's manifests identified it as part of the 6th Supply Division, last recorded in November 1942. Its mission, to deliver food, ammunition, and winter gear to Stalingrad's encircled units. It never arrived. The rediscovery reignited public interest. Newspapers cautiously reported the find, while television programs speculated about Soviet mysteries of the steppe. Veterans groups demanded an official investigation, But the Ministry of Defense quietly discouraged further expeditions, citing sensitivity of archival materials. The renewed silence suggested that, even after the fall of the USSR, the machinery of secrecy endured. Yet the question had already escaped into the public sphere. How could so many men, vehicles, and records vanish from the largest war in human history and remain forgotten for half a century? As historians continued the disappearances were not the product of a single event, but a perfect storm of systemic flaws: over-centralized command, falsified reporting, lack of communication, and the vast indifference of geography. The lost convoys became emblematic of how the Soviet system waged war, with immense human endurance, but built on fear and deception. Every missing truck represented not only a logistical failure, but a moral one, a moment when obedience to the system outweighed the preservation of life. Those who perished in the steppe were not victims of the enemy, but of their own country's relentless drive for results.